Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. You're used to seeing Dr. Paul's face here, but he's traveling today. So I'll give you a little bit of a briefing, talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind and in the news that I think are very important. I don't know if many of you have seen, it's been reported in a few different places about this Chinese system called the social credit system. And this is a way of ranking Chinese citizens based on a number of different criteria. There was a document issued in 2014 called the Planning Online for the Construction of a Social Credit System, 2014 to 2020. The idea is that by 2020, this system would be in place throughout China. And what it does essentially is it gives citizens a score, sometimes starting with 1,000. And if you can maintain that by doing certain things, or you could lose points by doing certain things. You can get deductions from traffic violations, from avoiding taxes, even such things as maybe purchasing too much alcohol, doing things of that nature. And then you can bump up your score, according to reports, by doing things like volunteering and giving to charities and things of that nature. And it sounds very tyrannical. China has hundreds, by some estimates, 200 million cameras around the country with facial recognition. And it's been referred to as a digital dictatorship. To some degree, it's true. There are some understandable reasons why they have a system like this, because China does not have the kind of credit scores and credit checks that we have here. However, definitely, because it's designed by the state, there is the issue of dissent, of political dissent. If you're a political dissenter, if you disagree with the government, if you write things about government corruption, your credit score goes down. You lose credit points in that case. And what happens when your credit points go down? Well, you lose privileges, according to numerous press reports. Your ability to move around the country is restricted. Your ability to purchase air or train travel is restricted. Your ability to get a job, particularly a government job, is restricted. So it is a way of keeping people in line, not just keeping people having good behavior. It's a way to criminalize and marginalize and stigmatize those people who dissent from politics. And it sounds terrible, and it's being used to ramp up anti-Chinese sentiment here in the U.S., of course. Is being used by forces that need to have an enemy, that love to have an enemy, and that profit off of an enemy. But if you think about this for a little bit, and I'm aided in this by a good friend of mine, Kurt Nimmo, who's an excellent libertarian type of writer, and he points out, and we have his article on the Ron Paul Institute website. He points out that, this, as bad as this sounds, it's not really that different than what we have in the U.S. We have a form of it. It's not as ominous, perhaps. But if you look at how the no-fly list works in the U.S., you can't travel if you're on a list. People that are political dissenters have been put on the list. People have been accidentally put on the list. Look at NSA surveillance of essentially all of our communications. Intelligence monitoring of our social media posts and things of that nature. Our cell phones being turned into tracking devices. And the other thing is how the big tech companies, the social media companies, collude with government to regulate what we can say and can't say. And that is really a point to consider. The goal, of course, is to suppress political dissent in the U.S. and in China. We know that the social media companies, under the auspices of the Russiagate, what should we call it, scam, the Russiagate propaganda, the idea that Russia somehow, the unproven idea after a year and a half or so, that Russia somehow was able to manipulate the elections by putting on Facebook a couple of pictures of Hillary wrestling with Jesus, that somehow this threw the election. But under these auspices, the social media companies, as you know, were dragged up to Capitol Hill several months ago, where members of Congress, where senators did what they do, which is to preen and to play for the cameras and to yell and scream a lot. And they were told essentially that if you do not get more involved in screening out so-called fake news, if you do not get involved in keeping all of these horrible, dangerous foreign actors off of your platforms, we are going to regulate you. We are going to do things you don't want. And of course, as all large corporations, as most corporations, they immediately kowtowed to the government and said, oh, don't worry, we will do what you say. We will back up what you say. We'll put measures in place to make a more acceptable social media environment. So one of the first things they did? They teamed up with the Atlantic Council, and we've talked about it on this show before. They've teamed up with the Atlantic Council to determine what is fake news and what is real news. Well, as we know, the Atlantic Council is funded not only by the United States government, which certainly has at least the indirect effect of our tax dollars going to suppress our ability to freely express ourselves, but it's also funded largely by foreign governments. So to combat foreign governments meddling in our domestic affairs, Facebook hires an organization that's funded by foreign governments, by definition meddling in our foreign affairs. But that is only part of what Facebook and the social media have done. And this brings us to really a point that I would like to make. And this is thanks primarily to the Moon of Alabama website, which we do frequently have a look at. Facebook has gone even further than team up with the Atlantic Council and a few other organizations. It's actually just partnered to combat foreign manipulation of elections. It's partnered with the U.S. government-funded NGO that specializes in manipulating elections. That's right. Last week, Facebook announced that it would partner with the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute to, quote, slow the global spread of misinformation that could influence elections. Now, what are the IRI and NDI? It's the abbreviation of those two organizations. They're both arms of the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy was set up in the 1980s by President Reagan after his administration had been infiltrated by some of the very same neocons that are still, believe it or not, ruling the roost in Washington these days. And a lot of this was a reaction to the revelations in the 70s of CIA manipulations overseas at home. And so the National Endowment for Democracy was created to be kind of an overt CIA. And even the first head of it, one of the founders of the NED, Alan Weinstein, said, the NED does in the open what the CIA has done in secret. So the point of the National Endowment for Democracy since its creation in the 1980s has been to overthrow governments, to be involved in regime change, to be involved in propping up certain media outlets in foreign countries that take the U.S. line. Essentially what it is an organization that subsidizes fake news overseas, that manipulates perceptions overseas, that does everything that the Russian government is accused of doing with no evidence here in the U.S. So this is the group that Facebook is going to partner with to decide what in the foreign realm are fake news stories. So what does that mean for organizations like, for example, the Ron Paul Institute? We publish a lot of stories about foreign affairs. Primarily our focus is in U.S. interventionism. As you know, we're opposed to the U.S. government intervening in the affairs of other countries overseas. So naturally, we're opposed to things like the National Endowment for Democracy. We're opposed to the IRI and the NDI going over in our name and manipulating elections overseas, which they do habitually, and using our tax dollars to do so. So what happens when we write an article or published an article and put it up on Facebook that challenges the U.S. line the U.S. government line on a particular topic, that challenges things, for example, like Russiagate, that challenges the U.S. Ongoing war against Venezuela because they don't like the fact that the country with the world's largest oil reserves is not bowing down to U.S. government dictates. What happens when we raise these issues? Well, the National Endowment for Democracy is going to judge whether our articles are fake news or not. This is an entity that is funded by the United States government. It's essentially fully funded by the United States government. It's essentially really by definition a U.S. agency, a U.S. government agency that does the bidding of the U.S. government, that now will determine, in partnership with social media companies, whether or not people are allowed to see our posts. Now, if this doesn't come as close as you can imagine to a violation of the First Amendment to the U.S. government, even if one step removed, manipulating, restricting our ability to express ourselves, to write what we wish, to have a free press and a free media, I don't know what does. So it is chilling. It's easy to sit back and look at China's social credit system and say, gosh, this is a digital dictatorship. This is a chilling, something that 1984 couldn't have imagined, something that the Soviet and Nazi attempts to control the population couldn't have imagined. This is a high-tech way of keeping people in line. It's very easy to think that way, and there certainly is a lot of truth to that. But we also need to look a lot closer at what's happening in our own society. We need to look a lot closer at what social media companies are doing, and there is an argument that, oh, these are private companies. We have no right to tell them what to do. We have no right to influence them. They're private companies. Well, that certainly is the case to a degree, but as Dr. Paul has often said, they are in bed with government. We have numerous examples of them being in bed with government. When they're called to Capitol Hill, they go up to Capitol Hill and they do the government's bidding. When it comes time to hire organization to determine what is real news and what is fake news, they hire the experts in fake news. The National Endowment for Democracy, the Atlantic Council. These are fake news experts. They live and die by fake news. They're manipulating us. They're manipulating our viewpoints. They're trying to outlaw, to criminalize dissent, political dissent. They're trying to make it criminal to oppose U.S. intervention overseas. They're trying to make it that we can't even be seen. You're invisible if you oppose U.S. intervention overseas. And that would be bad enough if we had a stellar record. If everywhere the U.S. has intervened, a Switzerland has popped up like 100 flowers. But as we know, the track record is very different. Hence, the need that they have to manipulate information, to hide what we have to say, to keep us from exposing the lies that they churn out day in and day out, the fake news, the government fake news. They have to repress and suppress us because their track record is so bad. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. The list goes on. You could go back to 1953 in Iran to look at the disasters of U.S. interventionism. But you may not hear about them in the future, because if this new operation is successful, if this unholy partnership between the so-called private companies and the U.S. government-funded non-government organizations is successful, you simply won't see us anymore. You won't see the Ron Paul Institute anymore. You won't see the Ron Paul Liberty Report anymore. It'll just be buried. It'll cease to exist. It really is the same kind of digital dictatorship, and we find it very, very chilling. So keep an eye out. Keep an eye on what they're saying. Watch the social media. Let's look for alternatives. Let's look for alternatives that are not manipulated by government. But you can always go to places like the Ron Paul Institute website, ronpaulinstitute.org, Mises.org for information on economics. You can go to LouRockwell.com, antiwar.com, RonPaulLibertyReport.com. They're there. The social media would like to suppress what they have to put out, but you can still find them. You might have to search a little harder, but it is worth the search. It's worth the effort. So keep an eye out, keep a close watch, subscribe to the Ron Paul Liberty Report while you still can on YouTube and elsewhere, and let's together fight this attempt to create a digital dictatorship here in the United States. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.